Welcome back to the Book Nook podcast. We are diving deep today into a book that has really captured a lot of attention.
Yeah.
Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind by Yuval Noah Harari.
The big one.
It is, and it's caused quite a stir. So we're going to take a look at some of the big ideas that Harari lays out.
Yeah, and some of the things that maybe people haven't thought about when they read this.
Absolutely. So right out of the gate, Harari kind of dives into this question of like, how did Homo sapiens come to be?
Right.
And one of the things I thought was really interesting is that he acknowledges that the fossil record is not perfect. It doesn't give us the complete picture.
And that's something that's echoed by a lot of scientists who study human origins. You know, the fossil record's great,
Yeah.
but it doesn't tell the whole story.
So what does that mean for us as we're trying to understand our own history, right? Like there are these gaps, and so how do we fill those in and how do we account for them? So he attributes the development of human language and abstract thought to this period he calls the cognitive revolution.
Oh.
So there's like this rapid advancement, but his explanation for it is kind of vague. He just says accidental genetic mutations, but doesn't really go into detail about what those mutations were.
Right. How did that happen?
Exactly.
How likely was that to happen?
Like, how do we go from, not having language to having language?
Right.
I mean, think about that, like the ability to form complex thoughts.
Yeah.
To communicate, to imagine things that don't exist.
Yeah.
These are huge leaps forward, and evolutionary biologists have been wrestling with this question for decades.
Yeah, I think it helps to highlight that gap, like you were saying earlier. Like, we don't even know what those mutations would be.
Right.
So how could we possibly even come up with a probability of how likely they were to happen?
Exactly. So I think that's something really important to keep in mind as we're going through this book.
Excellent.
And speaking of going through this book, let's remind our listeners to subscribe to the Book Nook podcast and leave a review.
Definitely do that.
It really helps other people find the show and join us on these fascinating explorations.
For sure.
So another big claim that Harari makes that I want to get into is this idea that there are no gods in the universe.
Okay, so very provocative.
They're very provocative.
Right from the beginning.
Right, and this is kind of like the foundation of his entire worldview.
Yeah.
And he goes on to argue that religion is essentially a product of evolution.
Okay.
So it's this tool that emerged to promote social cohesion, to get people to cooperate.
Okay, interesting.
Through these shared myths.
Through shared myths.
But here's where I get a little skeptical.
Okay.
I can see how shared beliefs might help a group function better.
Yeah.
Like, you have everyone on the same page.
Right.
But how do we explain the diversity and the complexity of religious beliefs throughout history and across cultures?
Yeah, like different religions all over the place.
Right. So things like self-sacrifice, asceticism, like denying yourself pleasure and comfort, unwavering faith in the face of danger. These don't always seem to fit neatly into this purely evolutionary framework.
Right.
Where survival and reproduction are the primary drivers.
Yeah, because you think about like survival of the fittest.
Right.
And you think, okay, well, if that's all it is, why would I deny myself?
Right. Why would I put myself in harm's way?
Right.
If the goal is just to stay alive and to pass on my genes.
Exactly, and to reproduce.
Right.
So it's interesting.
So it's like there's something more there.
Yeah, it's a good point.
Right.
It is a good point.
And so, Harari talks about like animal sacrifice as an example of this.
Oh, okay. So how would that fit in?
Right. How does that benefit a group's survival or the concept of the Sabbath? Right. A day of rest when work is forbidden.
Yeah.
Like on the surface, that seems to go against the idea of maximizing your resources.
Totally.
So it's like maybe shared myths and religious beliefs aren't just accidental byproducts of evolution.
Okay.
But could they be intentional features
What you're saying.
of human societies designed for a higher purpose?
Okay.
Like fostering harmony and cooperation beyond mere survival.
So there's like a plan.
Right. It's like a built-in feature.
Like a design.
Right.
I like that.
And there's actually some anthropological evidence that challenges Harari's very linear view of religious evolution.
Okay.
And a good example of this is in Don Richardson's book, Eternity in Their Hearts.
Okay, I've heard of that one.
He documents the beliefs of the Santal people.
Okay.
And this is a group that claims to have originated as monotheists.
Okay.
So believing in one God. But then their belief system devolved into animism.
Oh, wow. So it like went backward?
Exactly. So instead of religion always evolving from simple to complex,
Right.
like Harari suggests.
Yeah.
It's possible that it can also devolve or become less sophisticated over time.
Oh, that's interesting.
Right.
I like that.
So it challenges that traditional narrative.
Yeah, for sure.
So it's like, okay, well, if that's possible, then what else might Harari be overlooking?
Right. What other assumptions is he making?
Exactly. And that brings us to, I think, one of the most thought-provoking aspects of Sapiens, which is the implications for human rights and morality.
Ooh, that's a big one.
Yeah. Because if we follow Harari's logic all the way through, he's essentially arguing that concepts like human rights, equality, and justice are basically imagined orders. They don't have an objective basis in this purely materialistic evolutionary framework.
Okay, so almost like they're made up.
Right, they're just stories we tell ourselves.
Okay, so then what does that mean for us as a society if there is no objective basis?
Right, that's the question. Like, if these are just fictions, what prevents the collapse of social order?
Yeah.
And I remember this one passage in the book where he compares his view to that famous line in the Declaration of Independence.
Oh, yeah.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights.
Everyone knows that line.
Right. And Harari's point is that if you take a strictly evolutionary perspective, those ideas of creation, equality, unalienable rights, become really problematic.
They don't fit
into that worldview.
Right. It's like, okay, well, if it's all just about survival of the fittest, then where do these concepts come from?
Right. Are they just made up to make us feel better?
Right. Exactly. Are they just useful fictions that help us to corroborate, but ultimately have no real grounding in reality?
It's a lot to think about. It is a lot to think about. And it's I think what makes Sapiens such a compelling read.
Yeah.
Because it forces us to confront these fundamental questions about what it means to be human, where we came from and where we're headed.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's what we're doing here on this deep dive as well.
Absolutely. We'll continue to explore these questions and more as we
unpack the rest of the book.
Go further into Sapiens.
Absolutely. Welcome back to the Book Nook podcast. We're continuing our exploration of Sapiens, a brief history of humankind. And as you can tell, there's a lot to unpack here.
Yeah, there really is. I mean, Harari's take on human history and the nature of belief systems definitely has sparked a lot of debate.
For sure.
And it leads to even deeper questions.
Okay.
Like, if our minds are just the product of blind, unguided evolution, like Harari suggests, can we really trust our own reasoning?
Yeah.
How can we be sure that any of our conclusions about the world, including the idea of evolution itself, are actually accurate?
That's a great question, and it's something that philosophers have been grappling with for centuries.
Really?
Yeah, it's actually known as the evolutionary argument against naturalism.
Okay, I've never heard of that. What is that exactly?
Well, it boils down to this. If our cognitive abilities are simply the result of these survival-driven processes, how can we be certain that they're giving us a reliable picture of reality?
Oh, I see what you mean. It's like you're building a house with tools you're not even sure you can trust.
Exactly.
The foundation could be shaky.
Yeah, and what's fascinating is that Darwin himself actually expressed doubts about this.
Really?
Yeah, he wrote about what he called his horrid doubt.
Horrid doubt.
Yeah.
Wow.
He was concerned about whether the convictions of the human mind, which he believed evolved from lower animals, could actually be considered trustworthy.
That's pretty profound coming from the father of evolutionary theory.
Yeah, and his doubt has really resonated with a lot of thinkers over the years, including C.S. Lewis and the evolutionary biologist J.B.S. Haldane.
Yeah.
And they all kind of recognize this potential for contradiction. How can we believe in the truth of a worldview that simultaneously undermines the very basis of truth itself?
So let me see if I understand this correctly. If our ability to reason, to make moral judgments, to understand scientific concepts is simply a product of random mutations and survival pressures. Can we ever really be confident in any of our conclusions about the world?
It's a question that really gets to the heart of how we make sense of our own existence.
Yeah, for sure. It's a big one.
And it leads us to another really interesting theme that Harari touches on in Sapiens,
Okay.
which is the concept of human exceptionalism.
Okay, so what does he say about that?
Well, Harari and his colleague Sam Harris actually express quite a bit of skepticism about the idea that humans hold this special place in the natural world.
Okay, I can see why that would be controversial.
Definitely.
But there are a lot of people who argue that there's overwhelming evidence to support human exceptionalism.
Oh, absolutely.
So what kind of evidence are we talking about?
Well, we can look at just our distinct physical traits.
Okay.
I mean, we're the only species that walks upright on two legs. Wears clothing has developed such a wide range of technologies.
Right. It's not just about our physical characteristics, though.
No, not at all. Think about our mastery of fire, our ability to communicate through complex language,
Right.
to understand and express abstract ideas, our capacity for art, music, religion, and science.
It's like this whole other level of awareness and creativity
Exactly.
that seems to set us apart.
And what about the development of moral codes and systems of justice?
Yeah, you don't see other animals doing that.
Precisely. And consider what Noam Chomsky, the famous linguist, has said about human language. He describes it as a cognitive Big Bang,
Wow.
unlike anything else in the animal kingdom.
That's a powerful image.
It is. And Wesley Smith, a prominent bioethicist, points out that humans are the only species that really grapple with ethical dilemmas and feel a sense of responsibility for their actions.
That's true. I mean, we're constantly questioning right and wrong, trying to figure out what it means to live a good life.
And these aren't just minor differences. They represent this fundamental leap forward in cognitive abilities and awareness.
Yeah, and I think it's worth considering that maybe the very difficulty we have in explaining the origin of these unique traits actually strengthens the case for human exceptionalism.
How so?
Well, it suggests that there's something truly extraordinary about our species that goes beyond simple evolutionary explanations.
So the more we try to fit humans into this purely materialistic evolutionary narrative, the more we highlight the aspects of our being that defy easy categorization.
It's like we're almost forcing the issue.
Right.
Trying to squeeze a square peg into a round hole.
Exactly. And I think that's where things start to get really interesting because it opens up the possibility for other explanations.
Yeah, and we'll definitely dive into some of those alternative perspectives in a bit. But first, we need to take a quick break. But before we do, I want to remind our listeners to subscribe to the Book Nook podcast. And if you're enjoying the show, we'd love for you to leave us a review.
Definitely, it helps other curious minds find us and join the conversation.
We'll be right back with more on Sapiens. Welcome back to the Book Nook podcast. We're wrapping up our deep dive into Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind by Yuval Noah Harari.
It's been quite a journey. I feel like we've just scratched the surface.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground from the rise of Homo sapiens to the development of language and to those unique cognitive abilities.
And of course, that complex relationship between evolution and belief systems.
Right, and we've encountered so many different perspectives along the way.
Yeah. What stands out to you as we kind of come to the end of our exploration?
I think for me, it's how Sapiens, while being this incredibly thought-provoking book, ultimately leaves us with more questions than answers.
I think that's what makes it so compelling.
Right. It doesn't shy away from these big, complex issues.
And it forces us to really think critically about our own assumptions.
Absolutely, and sparks so many conversations and debates.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to encourage our listeners to continue exploring these themes.
Yeah, if you're intrigued by the idea of intelligent design as a potential explanation for the origins of life, there's a whole world of resources out there to guide your exploration.
And for those interested in different perspectives on the history and evolution of religious beliefs, we highly recommend Don Richardson's book, Eternity in Their Hearts.
Yeah, it offers a fascinating look at how different cultures have understood the divine.
And we also touched on those philosophical implications of the evolutionary argument against naturalism.
Right, which really challenges us to examine the foundation of our knowledge and beliefs.
It's all about keeping those critical thinking skills sharp.
Absolutely, and being open to new ideas.
Exactly.
So on that note, we want to leave you with one final thought to ponder.
Okay, I like this.
What if, instead of viewing human exceptionalism as this obstacle to a purely materialistic understanding of the world, we embrace it as evidence of something truly remarkable?
I like that.
What if our capacity for love, compassion, creativity, the pursuit of truth, points to a designed universe where our existence has meaning and purpose?
It's a question that goes beyond the scope of Sapiens, but it's one worth considering.
Definitely. And we'd like to extend a huge thank you to everyone who joined us on this deep dive into Sapiens.
We hope you found it insightful and engaging.
And maybe even a bit challenging.
If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe to the Book Nook podcast.
For more captivating conversations about the books that shape our world.
And leave us a review. Your feedback helps other book lovers like you find the show.
You can find a link to purchase Sapiens in the description below. Thanks for listening to the Book Nook podcast, and happy reading.